My name is Brenda. I am 68 years old, and my occupation is a retired emergency room nurse. When my only child stood in my living room sobbing, begging for $150,000 to save his family from absolute bankruptcy, I gave him my entire life savings. But when I drove over later that evening with a hot meal to comfort them, I did not find a family in crisis. I found an open garage and a brand new cherry-red Ferrari gleaming under the lights. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just smiled, turned right around and walked back to my car, knowing exactly where I would be the moment the bank opened the next morning. I spent 40 years pulling grueling double shifts in a Chicago hospital, raising my son Jamal alone after his hard-working father passed away. I wore faded scrubs and skipped vacations just to put him through a top-tier business school debt-free. Now he was a successful financial consultant, but the boy I raised was gone. That afternoon, he had sat on my couch, crying about foreclosure and crushing medical bills. He used my 8-year-old grandson as a pawn, asking how I could let little Jordan become homeless. My heart broke, and I handed over the check without a single hesitation. Bringing over my homemade peach cobbler was just a motherly instinct, but seeing that luxury sports car parked exactly where financial ruin was supposed to be completely opened my eyes. His tears were nothing but a calculated performance, but the stop payment I was about to place on that check was going to be a very harsh reality. For 40 years, the sterile smell of bleach and the frantic beeping of heart monitors were the soundtrack to my life. Working as an emergency room nurse in Chicago is not a job for the faint of heart, especially during those brutal, bone-chilling winters. It was exhausting work, the kind that settles deep into your joints and stays there forever. But I had a reason to push through the pain, and his name was Jamal. My husband, a proud and hard-working transit worker, was taken from us by a sudden stroke when Jamal was just a little boy. The day we buried him, I stood at the cemetery, held my son's tiny hand, and made a silent vow to the heavens. I promised that this boy would never lack for anything, that he would have every opportunity his father and I never got. From that day on, I essentially lived at the hospital. I picked up every double shift, every holiday rotation, and every night shift nobody else wanted to take. My hands grew calloused. My feet constantly ached, and there were nights I cried quietly in the shower, just so my son would not hear my exhaustion. While other mothers were taking their families on summer vacations, I was sitting at my Formica kitchen table at 2 a.m, meticulously clipping coupons and balancing my checkbook to the very last cent. I wore the same faded, threadbare scrubs year after year. When the hems frayed, I did not buy new ones. I simply hemmed them myself. Every dollar saved was another brick in the foundation of my son's future. And my goodness, it worked. Jamal grew up smart, ambitious, and fiercely driven. When he got accepted into one of the most prestigious business schools in the country, I felt a pride so deep it washed away decades of physical pain. I paid every tuition bill, every housing fee, and every textbook cost out of my own pocket. On the day he walked across that stage to receive his degree, he did so completely debt-free. I gave him the ultimate head start in life, handing him a clean slate bought and paid for with my sweat, my aching back, and a mother's unconditional devotion. I genuinely believed I had raised a man of honor, a man who understood the immense value of sacrifice. For a while, everything was exactly as I had dreamed it would be. Jamal climbed the corporate ladder with breathtaking speed, quickly establishing himself as a highly sought-after financial consultant. I watched my boy transition from a hungry graduate to a confident executive in tailored suits. But success has a funny way of revealing a person's true character, or perhaps it simply gives them the funding to become who they really are inside. The real shift in my son began the moment he met Chloe. Chloe was a superficial, fiercely entitled woman who came from a flashy new money family. She wore her privilege like a weapon. Her world was built entirely on designer labels, exclusive country club memberships, and maintaining an image of flawless luxury. From the very moment Jamal introduced us, I could feel the cold calculation in her eyes. She looked at my modest home and my simple clothes, not with respect, but with thinly veiled pity. She was the kind of woman who believed a person's worth was printed directly on their bank statement. And slowly, like a slow-acting poison seeping into a well, her values became his values. Jamal stopped dropping by for our traditional Sunday dinners, claiming he was constantly too busy with networking events and golf tournaments. When he did call, the conversations were incredibly rushed and superficial. He began talking exclusively about stock portfolios, luxury brands, and high society galas, entirely discarding the humble roots that had shaped him. He was actively remodeling himself to fit perfectly into Chloe's shallow world, and in doing so, he began to systematically erase the mother who had built the very stage he was standing on. The distance between us widened into a massive chasm, filled with constant biting disrespect. It was not just Chloe, but her entire family, especially her brother Trent. Trent was a slick, fast-talking real estate broker who wore entirely too much cologne and spoke to everyone as if he were closing a shady deal. Whenever family gatherings forced us into the same room, Trent and Chloe made it their personal mission to remind me that I did not belong in their elevated social circle. They would stand right in my living room sipping expensive wine they brought themselves, because mine was supposedly undrinkable, and openly mock my home. Trent would tap my walls with his knuckles, loudly suggesting that my house was a tear-down project waiting to happen, while Chloe would make passive-aggressive comments about the 10-year-old sedan sitting in my driveway. She would ask if I felt safe, driving such an ancient, unreliable machine, wrapping her cruel insults in a sickeningly sweet tone of fake concern. To them, I was not the respected matriarch of the family. I was an embarrassing relic of Jamal's working-class past, an inconvenient secret they wished they could just hide in the attic. But the deepest wound did not come from their sneers or their relentless condescension. It came from the silence of my own son. Jamal, the boy I had literally broken my back to provide for, would stand right there swirling his expensive scotch and let them disrespect me in my own house. He would chuckle awkwardly, look down at his designer shoes and quickly change the subject actively, choosing to protect his wife's fragile ego over his mother's dignity. Every time he failed to defend me, a small piece of my heart withered away. That silent complicity was the heaviest betrayal of all, long before the money was ever involved. I remember the exact moment the trap was sprung. It was a gloomy Tuesday evening, the kind where the rain hits the windows so hard it sounds like someone knocking. But then the actual doorbell rang frantic and sharp. When I opened the door, Jamal and Chloe were standing on my porch. Jamal looked completely disheveled. His tie was undone. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was physically shaking. Chloe stood slightly behind him, wearing an oversized sweater and absolutely no makeup. For a woman who never checked the mail without a full contour and lashes, this was alarming. I immediately ushered them inside, my maternal instincts kicking in, just like they did when Jamal was a little boy, scraping his knee. He collapsed onto my floral sofa and buried his face in his hands, letting out a sob that tore right through my chest. I asked him what was wrong, and the story poured out of him like a broken dam. He claimed a catastrophic market crash had wiped out his firm's investments. He talked about sudden astronomical medical bills Chloe had supposedly incurred from a private clinic that their insurance refused to cover. He painted a picture of absolute financial devastation, telling me that the bank was initiating foreclosure on their home by the end of the week. My mind was racing. I asked him how much they needed to stop the bank. Jamal looked at the floor, crying, and whispered that they needed exactly $150,000 to save the house and keep them out of bankruptcy. $150,000. That was the bulk of the retirement fund I had bled for. That was 40 years of double shifts, dealing with trauma and chaos in the emergency room, saving every penny, so I would never be a burden to anyone in my old age. I hesitated. I sat there in my armchair, processing the sheer magnitude of that number. It was my safety net. It was my peace of mind. And then, right on cue, Chloe played her trump card. She stepped forward, tears perfectly welling in her eyes, and looked at me with an expression of pure, fabricated terror. She asked me what was going to happen to my grandson. She asked me with a trembling voice if I really wanted 8-year-old Jordan to be homeless. She painted a picture of my sweet, innocent grandson sleeping in a motel, losing his school friends, having his entire life uprooted because of a financial mistake. That was all it took. The mere thought of my grandbaby suffering erased every ounce of caution I had. I stood up, walked into my bedroom, and opened the small floor safe hidden in my closet. I pulled out my checkbook. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely form the letters, but I wrote out the check for $150,000. I handed it to my son. Jamal hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, thanking me over and over, calling me his savior, the best mother in the world. Chloe hugged me too, sobbing into my shoulder. I went to bed that night with a depleted bank account, but my heart felt full, believing I had just saved my family from the brink of destruction. By the next afternoon, the adrenaline of the crisis had worn off, and a deep, nagging worry settled into my bones. I kept picturing Jamal's tear-stained face and Chloe's trembling hands. I knew what financial stress could do to a family. I had lived through it myself when Jamal's father passed away. I wanted to comfort them, to show them that no matter what material things they lost, they still had family. So I went into my kitchen and started baking. I spent 2 hours making my famous peach cobbler, the exact recipe my grandmother taught me, the one Jamal used to beg for when he had a bad day at school. I wrapped the warm glass dish in a thick towel, placed it carefully on the passenger seat of my car, and drove across town to their gated community. The drive took 45 minutes, and the whole way I prayed for my son's peace of mind. When I turned onto their pristine tree-lined street, I was expecting to find a house cloaked in misery. I expected drawn curtains and an atmosphere of defeat. Instead, as I pulled up to their massive property, I was forced to park half a block down because their entire circular driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Porsches, Mercedes, and sleek black SUVs lined the street. There was a valet stand set up near their front door. I sat in my old sedan, gripping the steering wheel, completely confused. A soft jazz melody drifted through the evening air, accompanied by the distinct clinking of crystal glasses and booming laughter. This was not a family in the middle of a foreclosure crisis. This was a lavish, catered party, feeling completely out of place in my simple slacks and sweater. I did not want to walk through the front door and embarrass them. I thought perhaps this was a work event. Jamal could not cancel a final facade he had to maintain for his clients. I decided to slip through the side gate, leave the cobbler on the patio table with a quiet note of support, and leave. I unlatched the wrought iron gate and walked down the side path toward the backyard. The path ran directly alongside their massive 3-car garage. The side door of the garage was propped wide open, spilling bright fluorescent light onto the grass. As I passed by, I glanced inside and my feet stopped moving. My breath caught in my throat. Sitting in the center of the immaculate garage floor was a brand new, gleaming cherry-red Ferrari. It still had the temporary dealer tags on it. It was flawless, extravagant, and easily worth the exact amount of money my son had wept for in my living room less than 24 hours ago. I stood there frozen, the warm dish of peach cobbler burning through the towel in my hands. The shock was so profound that my mind completely blanked. And then I heard voices coming from inside the garage. It was Jamal, accompanied by the unmistakable arrogant drawl of Chloe's brother Trent. Trent was holding a glass of wine, leaning casually against a workbench. I pressed my back against the cold brick of the garage wall, completely out of sight, and listened. Trent let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He complimented the car, telling Jamal it was an absolute beauty, a real statement piece for a man in his position. Jamal laughed back a smooth, relaxed sound that held absolutely no trace of the desperate, broken man who had cried on my sofa. Jamal thanked him, bragging that the dealership had almost given it to someone else, but he secured it just in time. Trent chuckled and asked how Jamal managed to pull off the cash for the down payment so quickly. Jamal's response sent a wave of pure ice directly into my veins. He laughed a cruel, dismissive sound and bragged about how easily he handled the old lady. He told Trent that all it took was a few tears and mentioning Jordan's name, and I handed over my life savings without asking a single complicated question. He spoke about me not as a mother who had sacrificed her entire youth for him, but as an easy mark, a gullible fool who was easily manipulated. I felt physically sick. My vision blurred and my chest tightened so violently I thought I was having a heart attack. But I did not drop the cobbler. I did not gasp. I forced myself to take slow, silent breaths. I crept further down the path, hiding behind a large decorative shrub right next to the open patio window. The window was cracked open to let the evening breeze in, and I had a perfect, unobstructed view into the brightly lit sunroom attached to the garage. Chloe walked into the room holding a champagne flute, looking radiant in a designer silk dress. There was no trace of the disheveled, makeup-free woman who had stood on my porch playing the victim. She walked over to Jamal, kissed his cheek, and asked if the boys were done admiring the new toy. Jamal wrapped his arm around her waist, completely at ease. Trent took a sip of his wine and looked at Jamal with a calculating, sharp expression. Trent asked Chloe if she was sure I had not asked any questions when I wrote the check. Chloe laughed a high-pitched grating sound and assured her brother that I was clueless. She mocked my house, she mocked my floral sofa, and she mocked how quickly I ran to my safe the second she brought up Jordan. There was no bankruptcy. There were no unexpected medical bills from a private clinic. The entire story was a meticulously crafted stage play designed to extract my retirement funds simply to purchase a status symbol. They had weaponized my love for my grandson just to buy a sports car. But the true horror, the ultimate betrayal that would forever change my life, was about to unfold. Trent swirled his wine, his face turning serious. He looked at Jamal and pointed out that if I was willing to hand over $150,000, that easily my mind must be slipping. He said it with such casual cruelty that it took a moment for his words to fully register in my mind. Trent, who worked in real estate and constantly looked for loopholes, began to outline a plan that made the fake bankruptcy look like child's play. He told Jamal and Chloe that my easy compliance was a golden opportunity. Trent explained that if they played their cards right, they could easily document my supposed mental decline. He explicitly suggested that they start a legal process to declare me mentally incompetent. He talked about securing a power of attorney and a full conservatorship. Chloe's eyes lit up with greedy excitement. She eagerly chimed in, pointing out that my house, though outdated and utterly embarrassing to her, sat on a prime double lot in a rapidly appreciating neighborhood. She casually mentioned that once they had control of my assets, they could sell my home, take the remaining bulk of my retirement funds, and use the money to upgrade their own lifestyle. Jamal stood there, listening to his wife and his brother-in-law plot the absolute destruction of my autonomy. I waited for him to stop them. I waited for the son I raised, the boy who used to hold my hand and tell me I was his hero, to draw a line. I waited for him to say that stealing my money was one thing, but stripping me of my rights and my home was going too far. But Jamal did not stop them. Jamal took a sip of his scotch and nodded. He agreed with Trent. Jamal stated that it made perfect financial sense. He reasoned that I was getting old anyway, that I lived alone, and that I would not know the difference if they moved me out. Trent smiled his slick, predatory smile and offered to set them up with a lawyer he knew, someone who specialized in fast-tracking conservatorship cases. They discussed dumping me in a cheap state-run facility, a place where they would not have to visit me, often freeing up all my assets for their exclusive use. They laughed about it. They literally toasted their glasses to my impending mental decline and their future financial windfall. They were not just content with taking my savings. They wanted to take my freedom, my dignity, and my home. They wanted to erase my independence and lock me away in a facility just to fund their extravagant, hollow lives. My own son, the man I had traded my youth and my body to support, had just agreed to sell me to the highest bidder. In that moment, standing in the shadows of their luxurious patio, something inside me completely shattered, but it was instantly replaced by something else. A profound, icy clarity. I did not feel the urge to scream. I did not feel the urge to confront them. The mother who would have cried for her lost son died right there behind that decorative shrub. The woman who stood up was a 40-year veteran of the emergency room, a woman trained to stay completely calm while dealing with massive trauma, a woman who knew exactly how to stop bleeding and how to save a life. And right now, the life I needed to save was my own. I looked at the glass dish of peach cobbler in my hands. I did not leave it on the table. I did not leave a note. I turned around and walked back down the side path, my steps completely silent on the concrete. I unlatched the gate, slipped out into the street, and walked back to my car. I placed the cobbler on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove away from their pristine neighborhood. I drove through the neon-lit streets of the city, my mind working with mathematical precision. They thought they had secured a massive payday. They thought they had fooled a gullible, weak-old woman. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. But they had made one massive biotechnology mistake. They had forgotten that bank checks for $150,000 do not clear instantly. They take time. And my bank opened at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. I drove home, a cold, serene smile spreading across my face, preparing for war. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot at 7:30 the next morning, watching the morning sun slowly hit the heavy glass doors. I had not slept a single wink. Instead of tossing and turning in my bed, I had spent the entire night brewing strong black coffee and gathering every financial statement, every bank book, and every piece of identification I owned into a thick leather folder. When the doors finally unlocked at exactly 8 o'clock, I was the very first person to walk inside the building. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly to the glass office of Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes had been my dedicated bank manager for 20 years. He was a profoundly good man who had watched me deposit my overtime checks week after week, year after year. He knew exactly how hard I had worked to build my retirement fund. He knew the exhausting night shifts I had pulled on Thanksgiving and Christmas, just to make sure Jamal always had a roof over his head and food on his plate. When he saw my face, he immediately stood up and closed his office blinds. He asked me what was wrong, because I imagine my expression was as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm off Lake Michigan. I sat down in the firm leather chair across from him and placed my heavy folder on his desk. I told him I needed to place an immediate stop payment on the check I had written the previous afternoon. Mr. Hayes looked at his computer screen, typed in my account details, and saw the pending transaction for $150,000. He asked me if I was absolutely certain, because a stop payment of this magnitude could cause serious financial ripples and trigger severe penalties for the recipient. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I explained to him exactly what I had seen in my son's garage the night before. I told him about the cherry-red Ferrari, the fake tears, and the chilling conversation I had overheard, where my own flesh and blood plotted to declare me mentally incompetent, just to steal my home and my freedom. Mr. Hayes turned completely pale. He had met Jamal several times over the years and could not believe the sheer level of sociopathic deceit. Without another word, he aggressively typed on his keyboard and officially authorized the stop payment. He then leaned across the desk and told me that stopping the check was simply not going to be enough to protect me. He warned me that if Jamal and his brother-in-law were truly planning to target my mental competency, they could try to freeze my assets with a shady court order before I even knew what was happening. We spent the next 3 hours completely restructuring my entire financial existence. Every dollar I had saved by scrubbing blood off my shoes in the emergency room was going behind a reinforced wall. Mr. Hayes helped me close my vulnerable checking and savings accounts and opened brand new ones with strict dual authentication security measures. We then initiated the complex paperwork to move the vast majority of my liquid assets and the deed to my home into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. It was a financial fortress designed to repel exactly the kind of vultures my son had invited into our lives. By the time I signed the final document, my money was locked away so tightly that no greedy son, no manipulative wife, and no slick real estate broker could ever touch a single dime of it without jumping through impossible legal hoops. Leaving that bank, I felt a massive weight lift off my tired shoulders. My life savings were safe, but my mind was still operating with a cold, surgical precision. I knew Jamal would try to manipulate the narrative once he realized the money was gone. I needed to make sure I had the ultimate upper hand for the war he was about to start. My next stop was a sleek, high-rise office building downtown. Mr. Hayes had personally recommended a brilliant attorney named Ms. Carter to me, and the moment I walked into her office, I knew she was exactly what I needed. Ms. Carter was a fierce, no-nonsense black woman in her early 50s who did not play games and did not waste words. I sat across from her polished mahogany desk and laid out the entire devastating situation. I played her the frantic voicemails Jamal had left me over the past week, where he audibly sobbed about his fabricated foreclosure. I showed her the highly manipulative text messages from Chloe, begging me to save little Jordan from becoming homeless and sleeping on the street. Ms. Carter listened to every recording and read every text with a look of absolute disgust settling over her sharp features. She told me we were going to build a wall of evidence so high that they would never be able to climb over it. We spent a solid hour legally documenting every single fraudulent message, logging the exact dates and times Jamal had used active deception to extort money from an elderly family member. Ms. Carter drafted a watertight cease and desist order, preventing Jamal, Chloe, and Trent from ever attempting to initiate guardianship or conservatorship proceedings against me. We also drafted a formal legal demand letter for the immediate repayment of a $20,000 loan. I had given Jamal 2 years prior a loan I had completely documented, but never actually expected him to pay back. Now I expected every single cent returned to me. After securing my legal defense, I drove straight back to my house. I contacted a premium private security firm and paid them a significant premium fee for same-day emergency service. By 4:00 that afternoon, 2 professional technicians were in my home, installing state-of-the-art hidden cameras. They placed a tiny, discreet lens inside the smoke detector in my living room, providing a perfect panoramic view of the floral sofa where Jamal had sat and wept his crocodile tears. They installed another high-definition camera near my front door, and a final one in the kitchen, capturing crystal-clear audio and video of anyone who entered my sanctuary. If my son and his entitled wife decided to storm into my home to demand answers, or try to intimidate me into writing another check, I was going to capture every single threat on tape. I wanted undeniable, irrefutable proof of their aggression, to support my legal standing in court. As the technicians packed up their gear and handed me the digital tablet to monitor the live feeds, I looked around my quiet, empty house. I had spent decades filling this space with pure love, incredible warmth, and the comforting smell of home-cooked meals. Now I was forced to turn it into a surveillance trap to protect myself from my own child. It broke my heart all over again. But the tears were completely gone. I was standing firmly in my power, and I was absolutely ready for the next phase of my defense. I sat down at my kitchen table, watching the clear video feed on my tablet, and I promised myself that I would never allow anyone to treat me like a disposable burden ever again. The trap had been flawlessly set, and I did not have to wait very long for the bait to be taken. At exactly 6 o'clock, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the granite kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed with Jamal's name. I took a deep, steadying breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and channeled every ounce of maternal strength I had left in my body. When I finally answered the phone, I let my voice drop into a soft, weary tone, purposely playing the role of the tired, forgetful old mother they so desperately believed me to be. Jamal's voice came through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet, fake enthusiasm. He greeted me cheerfully, calling me his favorite lady in the whole wide world. He told me he just wanted to check on me and see how I was feeling after our highly emotional visit the day before. He was completely unaware that the massive check he had eagerly deposited was currently frozen in the banking system. Large checks always take 48 to 72 hours to fully process and clear the verification channels, and Jamal was recklessly riding the high of a phantom deposit. I told him I was just resting my old bones, that my joints were acting up, and I was feeling a little bit confused today. I could practically hear the arrogant smirk on his face as he swallowed the bait hook, line, and sinker. He used his most condescending, babying voice to tell me that I needed to relax and not worry my pretty little head about anything anymore. Then he dropped the exact piece of information I was hoping for. He told me that his brother-in-law Trent was hosting a massive luxury yacht party that weekend to celebrate the end of summer. Jamal practically demanded that I attend the celebration. He claimed they wanted to treat me to a beautiful day of luxury on the water, to thank me for being such a wonderful, incredibly supportive mother. I knew the absolute truth. Trent Yacht Party was the ultimate stage for the new money crowd to show off their expensive toys, and Jamal was absolutely planning to pull up to the marina in his cherry-red Ferrari to flaunt his fabricated wealth in front of Trent wealthy friends. They wanted me there not to honor my sacrifice, but to parade me around as the naive, silent bankroll who unknowingly funded their extravagant lifestyle. They wanted me sitting quietly in the corner looking old and out of place while they drank expensive champagne and laughed behind my back about how easily they were going to put me in a state-run facility. I kept my voice perfectly fragile and told him I would be deeply honored to attend. I promised to wear my nice Sunday dress and bring a fresh batch of homemade cookies for his fancy friends. Jamal chuckled an ugly, dismissive sound and told me not to worry about bringing food because they were having a high-end private chef cater the entire event. He told me to just bring myself and enjoy the warm sunshine. When we finally ended the call, I set the phone down on the counter and let out a long, slow exhale. The performance was physically exhausting, but the clarity in my mind was razor sharp. I walked over to the hallway mirror and looked directly at my reflection. I did not look like a senile, helpless victim waiting to be discarded. I looked like a fierce woman who had survived 40 years of blood sweat and absolute chaos in a Chicago emergency room. I had saved countless lives throughout my career, and now I was going strictly into survival mode to save my own dignity. I spent the rest of the evening opening my closet and picking out exactly what I was going to wear to that yacht party. I was not going to show up looking like an embarrassing relic of the past. I was going to step onto that dock looking like the powerful, independent woman I truly was. The countdown had officially begun. In 48 hours, The bank would formally reject the massive check. The dealership would not receive their expected wire transfer. The financial house of cards Jamal and Chloe had built would collapse in a spectacular public fashion. And I was going to have a front row seat to watch the entire facade burn to the very ground. The marina was bathed in golden, late-afternoon sunlight when I stepped out of my cab. I did not wear my faded hospital scrubs or the sensible orthopedic shoes my son was so used to seeing me in. Instead, I wore a perfectly tailored emerald green pantsuit that fit me like a glove. My silver hair was professionally styled, and my favorite pearl earrings caught the light with every step I took. I walked up the wooden dock toward the massive 3-story luxury yacht, feeling the gentle ocean breeze on my face. My heart was beating steadily in my chest, completely devoid of fear. I was stepping onto the battlefield, and I was holding all the winning cards. When I boarded the yacht, the deck was already swarming with the city-wealthy elite. Women in designer sundresses and men in crisp linen shirts were sipping imported champagne and laughing loudly. Chloe spotted me almost immediately. Her fake smile plastered itself across her face as she strutted over with a glass in her hand. She loudly announced to her friends that her sweet little mother-in-law had finally arrived. She grabbed my arm with her perfectly manicured fingers and began parading me around like a charity case. She introduced me to her wealthy friends by making sure to mention how hard I had worked cleaning up messes in a public hospital just to get by. Trent, her brother, stood by the bar, chuckling into his drink. He looked me up and down and loudly joked that it was nice of me to take a break from clipping grocery coupons to see how the other half lives. I did not flinch. I just smiled politely and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. Jamal walked over a few minutes later, acting like the benevolent king of the marina. He was wearing a custom-fitted suit and a gold watch that caught the sunlight. He wrapped one arm around my shoulder, patronizingly patting my back while looking at his peers. He announced to the group that he always made sure to take care of his old mother. He said family was everything to him, and he would do whatever it took to keep me comfortable in my twilight years. The sheer hypocrisy of his words tasted like poison, but I simply nodded and took a slow sip of my water. I watched him closely, knowing the foundation of his entire arrogant display was currently collapsing in the banking system. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jamal moved to the center of the yacht deck. He grabbed a crystal champagne flute and tapped it with a spoon, calling for everyone's attention. The wealthy guests gathered around, raising their glasses in anticipation. Jamal puffed out his chest and delivered a grand sweeping toast to his own phenomenal success. He talked about his brilliant financial strategies, his hard work, and how he had recently navigated a brutal market with absolute perfection. Then, with a smug grin directed at Trent, he announced that to celebrate his recent triumphs, he had just treated himself to a little reward. He gestured grandly toward the marina parking lot, visible right from the deck of the yacht, where his brand-new cherry-red Ferrari was parked, gleaming under the streetlights. The crowd clapped and cheered, raising their glasses to his lavish new toy. I decided that was my cue. I picked up a silver butter knife from a nearby table and gently tapped the side of my own glass. The clear, sharp ringing sound cut through the applause and silenced the crowd. All eyes turned to me. Jamal looked mildly annoyed, but quickly put his fake supportive smile back on, assuming I was going to give a sweet, tearful speech about how proud I was of my successful son. I took a few steps forward, placing myself right in the center of the crowd. I looked at Jamal and told everyone that I also wanted to make a toast to my son and his incredible acting skills. The smiles on the faces of the guests faltered. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I kept my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for every single person on that yacht to hear. I told the crowd that just 48 hours ago, my highly successful son was sitting on my floral living room sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. I described in vivid detail how he cried about facing immediate foreclosure. I explained how he and his lovely wife told me they were drowning in medical debt and begged me for $150,000. I made sure to mention how they used my 8-year-old grandson Jordan as bait, claiming the boy would be sleeping on the streets if I did not drain my entire life savings to save them. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the yacht. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. The wealthy friends exchanged shocked, horrified glances. Jamal's face turned the color of wet ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Chloe tried to step forward and interrupt me, but I raised my hand and shot her a look so fierce it froze her in her tracks. I turned my attention back to Jamal. I told him that my heart broke for him that afternoon. So I wrote the check immediately because a mother will do anything to protect her child. But then I told the crowd about my little surprise visit later that same evening. I described walking up to the open garage with a warm peach cobbler, only to find the brand new cherry red Ferrari sitting exactly where their financial ruin was supposed to be. I told them about standing in the shadows and hearing Jamal brag to Trent about how easily he manipulated a gullible old woman out of her retirement fund just to buy a sports car. Jamal's hands began to physically shake. He stammered, trying to say it was all a misunderstanding. I smiled an ice-cold smile that sent a shiver through the crowd. I told him there was no misunderstanding at all. I told him I went to the bank the very next morning, right when the doors opened. I informed him loudly and clearly that I had placed a hard stop payment on that check, right at that exact second. As if the universe itself was orchestrating the timing, Jamal's cell phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen lit up with a barrage of frantic alerts. His bank was sending rapid-fire notifications. The down payment check he had written to the luxury car dealership using the phantom funds from my account had bounced. Because he had post-dated the transfer, his accounts were now massively overdrawn. The panic that washed over his face was absolute. He stared at the screen, watching his fabricated financial empire crumble into negative numbers in real time. Trent stepped forward while trying to salvage the situation for his sister, shouting that I had no right to embarrass them like this, and that I was clearly losing my mind. I turned to Trent and told him that his little plan to declare me mentally incompetent to steal my house was not going to work either. The heavy thud of confident footsteps echoed on the wooden dock, drawing everyone's attention. It was my attorney, Miss Carter, walking up the ramp with a thick leather briefcase under her arm. She did not wait for an invitation to board. She walked straight through the crowd of stunned guests and stopped directly in front of Jamal and Chloe. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. She handed the first envelope to Jamal, loudly announcing that it was a formal cease and desist order. She explicitly stated that any future attempt to initiate guardianship or conservatorship proceedings against me would be met with an immediate lawsuit for elder abuse and fraud. She then handed a second envelope to Chloe, stating it was a formal legal demand for the immediate repayment of a $20,000 loan they had taken from me 2 years prior. Fully documented and now legally actionable, Jamal stood there holding the documents looking like a cornered animal. He tried to yell that they could easily afford to fight this, that they were rich, and I was just a bitter old woman. But his shouting was suddenly drowned out by the roar of a heavy diesel engine. Everyone on the deck turned to look toward the marina parking lot. A massive flatbed tow truck was backing up directly toward the cherry red Ferrari. 2 men hopped out of the truck and began hooking heavy steel chains to the front axle of the luxury sports car. Jamal dropped his champagne glass, letting it shatter on the wooden deck, and ran toward the railing, screaming at the men to stop. One of the tow truck drivers looked up at the yacht, holding a clipboard. He yelled back that the wire transfer from the dealership had officially failed for insufficient funds, and they were ordered for immediate repossession. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as her wealthy friends began to whisper and pull out their phones to record the scene. Trent quietly backed away from his sister, suddenly wanting absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship. I stood on the deck of that yacht, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my son's arrogant facade. I watched the tow truck lift the bright red symbol of his greed off the pavement. I looked at Jamal, who was gripping the railing, watching his entire world fall apart, and I knew my job here was completely finished. In the months that followed that spectacular collapse on the marina dock, Jamal and Chloe faced complete and utter financial ruin. The humiliation of having that Ferrari repossessed in front of their elite social circle effectively destroyed their standing in that shallow community. I cut them off, entirely blocking their numbers and refusing to entertain their desperate apologies. I only maintained contact to see my grandson Jordan, and even then it was strictly on my own uncompromising terms. They bring him to a neutral location and they leave us be. With my assets safely protected, I decided it was time to finally live for myself. I sold my large house in Chicago, packed my bags, and bought a cozy little beachfront condo down in Florida. I even booked that luxury Caribbean cruise I had been dreaming about for 40 years, trading my faded scrubs for a swimsuit and a sun hat. Looking out at the ocean from my beautiful balcony, I finally realized something profoundly important about family and sacrifice. A mother's love is unconditional, but her bank account absolutely is not. You can break your back working grueling double shifts. You can give your children the entire world on a silver platter so they never have to struggle. But if they mistake your kindness for weakness and try to take your dignity away, you have every right to firmly show them the door. I raised a son with my whole heart, but I saved my own life with my whole mind. If you felt this story in your spirit, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know down in the comments. Where are you watching? From what time is it? And what would you have done to that Ferrari stay blessed queens?